The air in the great hall of the music conservatory was always the same. It was a thick mixture of old wood, floor polish, and the faint, sweet scent of rosin from 100 boughs. On this particular afternoon, it felt heavier than usual, charged with a silent tension that made it hard to breathe. Sunlight streamed through the tall, arched windows, cutting bright shapes onto the worn wooden floor, but no one seemed to notice the beauty of the day. All eyes were fixed on the stage, on the old man who stood in the center of it. He was a man who didn't need a title, though he had many. To the students, he was simply the Maestro, a living legend whose opinion could carve a path straight to the world's grandest concert halls or lead to a quiet, forgotten career teaching children in a small town. He was in his late 70s, with a shock of white hair that still defied gravity and a face carved with deep lines that told the story of a life spent in intense concentration. He moved slowly, but with a deliberate weight, as if every step was a note in a composition only he could hear. His hands, though spotted with age, were steady and expressive. When he spoke, his voice wasn't loud, but it had the gravelly texture of a lifetime of authority, and it filled the hall without effort. He stood behind a simple wooden music stand, where a folder of yellowed, fragile-looking paper lay. The students, a collection of the most gifted young musicians from around the world, sat perfectly still in their velvet seats. They held their instruments loosely, but their shoulders were tight, their breathing shallow. They had all learned the hard way that the maestro noticed everything, a flicker of the eye, a restless foot, a moment of lost focus. He let the silence hang for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over the room, making eye contact with no one and everyone at once. Then he gestured to the folder on the stand. "Today," he began, his voice a low rumble, "we do not talk about technique. We do not talk about interpretation. We talk about limits." He paused, letting the words settle. "We all have them. You, me, the greatest composers who ever lived. The trick is to know where they are." He carefully opened the folder. Inside were several sheets of paper, the edges brown and brittle. The ink was a faded brown, and the musical notation was a frantic, almost angry scrawl that seemed to dance across the page. A murmur went through the students. They all recognized the style, even if they had never seen this particular piece before. "This," the maestro said, a rare, almost imperceptible flicker of excitement in his eyes, "was found in a dusty trunk in an old Italian villa. A lost cadenza. For the first violin concerto?" He didn't need to say whose concerto. Everyone knew. The name of the legendary 19th century virtuoso, the man often called the devil's own violinist, hung in the air unspoken, written by the master himself in his youth. And then he threw it away. He picked up the top sheet, holding it up as if it were a sacred text. "And now you see why? Look at it, it's a joke. A madness." He pointed a long, thin finger at a section where the notes were a dense, black forest. "He writes for a hand with 6 fingers. He writes for a bow that can be in 2 places at once. It is not music. It is an acrobatic feat for a ghost." He let the page drop back onto the stand. "I have studied it. I have had other great players study it. We all agree. This is not a piece of music to be performed. It is a curiosity, a testament to the arrogance of youth." He looked out at the faces staring up at him, some pale with awe, others with the frustration of a puzzle they knew they could never solve. "So, I want you to look at it," he commanded. "I want you to understand what it is to see something truly impossible. I tell you now, with the full weight of my experience, that no one can play this. Not because you are not good enough, because it cannot be done. It is a wall, and today you will learn to see it and to respect it." Sitting near the back, in a seat that was slightly more worn than the others, was a young woman. She was not like the others. Her clothes were simple and well-mended, and the violin she held resting on her lap was not a gleaming, priceless instrument from a famous maker. It was an old, dark wood violin that had been her grandfather's. It had a few nicks and scratches, and a warmth to its tone that she had come to know better than her own voice. She was there on a scholarship from a small, salty-aired fishing village where the loudest music was the wind and the waves. Often she felt like an outsider, listening to the others talk of their famous teachers and their family's connections, but as she stared at the manuscript on the stand, something strange happened. The maestro's words washed over her, impossible. A wall cannot be done, but they didn't stick. All she could see were the notes. They didn't look like a wall to her. They looked like a wild, untamed river. The other students saw a mess of ink, a challenge too far. She saw a story. She saw a frantic energy, a cry of frustration, a burst of pure, unadulterated joy. It was as if the composer's soul was trapped on that page, beating against the bars of the staff lines, trying to get out. A small, defiant hum started in the back of her throat, a melody that wasn't on the page but felt like it should be. Her fingers, resting on the neck of her violin, began to twitch, tracing patterns in the air. The maestro said the music was for a ghost, for a hand that didn't exist. But looking at that frantic, beautiful scrawl, she felt a strange and powerful pull, a feeling deep in her gut that was telling her the exact opposite. It wasn't a wall, it was a door. And for some reason, she felt like she was the only one in the room who had been given a key. The old man on the stage had declared it impossible, but in her heart, a quiet, stubborn voice was rising up, whispering a single, thrilling word, maybe. The moment the master class ended, the spell was broken. The heavy silence in the hall shattered into a wave of whispered conversations and the scraping of chairs on the old wooden floor. Students gathered in small groups, their voices a mix of awe and relief, dissecting the maestro's every word. But the young woman from the fishing village didn't move. She remained in her seat, her eyes still fixed on the empty music stand where the impossible manuscript had been. The frantic, angry scrawl of notes was burned onto the back of her eyelids. She could hear it in her head, not as a melody, but as a chaotic storm of sound, a challenge that called out to her alone. She walked back to her small dorm room in a daze, the chatter of her classmates fading into a meaningless buzz. Her room was at the top of the building, a tiny space under the eaves with just enough room for a bed, a desk, and her music stand. The window looked out over the city's rooftops, a world away from the wide-open sea she knew. That night, she didn't bother with dinner. She took out her grandfather's violin, the dark wood feeling warm and familiar in her hands, and placed a copy of the manuscript on the stand. She had managed to get a photocopy from the library, the black notes looking stark and aggressive against the white paper. She took a deep breath and raised the bow. The first few bars were a disaster. Her fingers, which had always been so obedient, felt clumsy and slow. The notes were too close together, too fast. It was like trying to catch raindrops in a sieve. The sound that came out of her violin was not music. It was a series of scratches, squeaks, and thuds of the bow hitting the strings. She tried again, forcing her fingers to move faster, but they just got tangled. A wave of hot frustration washed over her. She put the violin down, her hands shaking. The maestro's words echoed in her mind, "It cannot be done." But the next morning, she was back at it. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale, gray light into her small room. She tried a different approach, breaking the music down into tiny pieces, just a few notes at a time. She played one section over and over 100 times, then 1,000. Her fingers began to ache, a deep, bone-tired soreness that was new to her. By the third day, the tips of her fingers were raw. Every time she pressed down on the strings, a sharp pain shot through her hand. She started to tape her fingers, but the tape made it hard to feel the strings. So she took it off and endured the pain. She became a ghost in the conservatory. She would go to her required classes, her mind only half there, her thoughts always drifting back to the manuscript in her room. Her friends would ask if she wanted to get lunch, and she would just shake her head, her eyes already looking toward the door. She forgot to call her family. She lived on stale bread from the cafeteria and cups of strong, black coffee. The world outside her room began to feel unreal, like a dream she was no longer a part of. The only thing that was real was the music, and the fight she was having with it. One night, after hours of frustrating practice, she almost gave up. She threw her bow down on the bed, the sound of it hitting the mattress loud in the quiet room. She felt a desperate, helpless feeling, a sense that the maestro was right, that she was a fool for even trying. She sat on the edge of her bed, her head in her hands, the raw skin of her fingertips throbbing. She thought about her village, about the simple, beautiful music she used to play with her grandfather. It all seemed so far away, but then she remembered something he had told her once. "If the path is blocked," he had said, his old voice as steady as the tide, "don't just try to break through the wall. Look for a door, or learn to fly." The next day, she didn't pick up her violin. Instead, she went to the library. She ignored the modern textbooks on technique and went to the dusty back shelves where the old books were kept. The air smelled of aging paper and leather. She pulled out biographies of the old virtuoso, the composer of the impossible piece. She read about his life, his rebellious nature, his love of showmanship. She found a book of his letters, translated from his native Italian. In one letter, he wrote about how he would sometimes use his whole hand to strike the strings, not just the tips of his fingers to get a percussive, dramatic sound. In another, he described holding his bow in a way that his teachers had called vulgar, but that gave him incredible speed and control. It was like a light turning on in a dark room. She realized she had been trying to play the music with her teacher's rules, with the modern, correct way of doing things. But this music wasn't modern or correct. It was wild and rebellious, just like the man who wrote it. That night, she went back to her room with a new sense of purpose. She looked at the manuscript not as a wall of notes, but as a map of a new territory. She started to experiment. She tried holding the bow the way the old composer had described. It felt awkward at first, but as she got used to it, she felt a new power in her wrist. She tried using the flat of her fingers for some of the runs, a technique her teachers would have scolded her for. It worked. The notes came out clearer, faster. She stopped thinking about what was right and started thinking about what worked. She remembered the fiddle players back in her village, how they would hold their instruments in all sorts of strange ways to get the sound they wanted. She started to incorporate some of their movements, a little bit of a sway, a dip of the shoulder. She wasn't just playing the notes anymore. She was trying to embody the spirit of the music. The hours turned into days, the days into a week, then two. Her life became a simple, focused ritual. Wake up, practice until her hands hurt, rest, read, and then practice again in the dead of night when the whole world was asleep. The pain in her fingers subsided as tough calluses formed. The ache in her shoulder became a familiar companion. The music began to change. The scratches and squeaks were replaced by a clear, powerful tone. She started to understand the story the music was telling. It wasn't just a show of speed. It was full of passion, of anger, of deep sadness, and of moments of pure, unadulterated joy. It was the sound of a human soul laid bare one night. About 2 weeks after the master class, she played the entire piece from beginning to end. There were still a few mistakes, a few notes that weren't perfect, but she played it. When the final, soaring note hung in the air of her small room, she didn't move. She stood with her violin held loosely, her eyes closed, listening to the silence that followed. A slow smile spread across her face. It was a smile of pure exhaustion, but also of triumph. She had done it. She had found the door. And now she was ready to show the maestro that walls were meant to be climbed. The final master class of the semester felt different from the very beginning. The usual nervous energy was still there, humming under the surface like a tightly wound string, but there was something else too. A sense of finality. This was it. The last chance to impress the maestro, to get a word of praise that might open doors, or a look of disappointment that could close them forever. The great hall seemed colder, the sunlight slicing through the windows more severe, casting long, dark shadows that made the students' faces look pale and drawn. The young woman from the fishing village sat in her usual spot, her grandfather's violin resting in its case by her feet. She felt a strange calm, a quiet stillness that had settled over her after 2 weeks of living in a storm of music. She had done the work. Now she just had to wait. The maestro was in a particularly dark mood. He moved across the stage like a storm cloud, his face a mask of dissatisfaction. One by one, the students went up to perform. A young man with a golden cello played a Bach suite with breathtaking technical skill, his fingers flying across the strings with a dancer's grace. When he finished, there was a moment of silence, and the students began to applaud. But the maestro held up a hand, cutting them off. "Technique," he said, his voice dripping with scorn. "Perfect, flawless, boring technique. You have built a beautiful, perfect house with no one living in it. Where is the pain? Where is the joy?" Bach was a man of God, but he was also a man who buried a dozen children. "You play like you've never had a bad day in your life. You have shown me your fingers, but you have not shown me your soul. Sit down." The young cellist's face crumpled as he returned to his seat, his head bowed. The rest of the students shrank in their chairs, their own confidence withering. A young woman with a flute played a piece that was meant to be light and airy, but her fear made it sound thin and reedy. The maestro didn't even let her finish. He just waved a hand, a gesture of weary dismissal. "No," he said. "Just no, you are afraid of the sound. You are afraid of your own breath. You are all afraid." He stopped in the center of the stage, his gaze sweeping over them, making them all feel small. You see a difficult passage, and you slow down. You see a high note, and you tense up. You see a challenge, and you look for an easier path. You all play with technique, but you have no courage. You see a wall, and you stop. His words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. A wall, and you stop. They echoed in the young woman's mind. She saw the wall he had built around the lost cadenza, the wall he had dared them all to see. She had spent 2 weeks trying to find a way over it, under it, through it. And now, watching him crush the spirits of her classmates, something inside her shifted. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was a feeling of rightness, a certainty that what she had done in the quiet of her room mattered. It wasn't just for her anymore. The maestro sighed, a deep, tired sound. "I think we are done for today. I have seen nothing to give me hope for the future of music." He turned to walk off the stage. That was the moment. A voice inside her screamed that this was her only chance. If she let him walk away now, the music she had unlocked would remain her secret, a ghost in her tiny room. Her heart began to pound, a heavy, frantic drum against her ribs. Her palms felt sweaty. What if she was wrong? What if the maestro was right and her hands were just not human enough? He would humiliate her. He would destroy her. But the thought of letting him walk away, of letting that wall stand, was worse. As the dismissed flutist returned to her seat, the young woman stood up. The movement was small at first, just a shift in her seat, but then she was on her feet. A few students nearby noticed, their eyes wide with confusion. The scraping of her chair on the wooden floor sounded like a gunshot in the silent hall. The maestro stopped at the edge of the stage and turned, his eyebrows drawn together in a line of irritation. She didn't run. She didn't rush. She walked, one step at a time, down the aisle and toward the stage. Every step felt like it was through mud. She could feel 100 pairs of eyes on her, could feel their collective gasp of shock and fear. Who was this quiet scholarship girl? What was she doing? She kept her eyes fixed on the maestro, on his stern, unforgiving face. She reached the steps leading up to the stage and climbed them. Her legs feeling strangely weak, she stopped a few feet from him. He looked down at her, his expression a mixture of annoyance and disbelief. He didn't say anything, waiting for her to explain this madness. "Maestro," she said. Her voice came out as a squeak at first, and she had to clear her throat and try again. "Maestro," she said, a little stronger this time. "I would like to attempt the cadenza." The name hung in the air. The lost cadenza. The impossible piece. A few students actually laughed, a short, nervous sound that was quickly choked off. The maestro stared at her for a long moment, and she thought she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not just annoyance, but a spark of curiosity, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Then he let out a short, sharp, mirthless laugh. "The impossible piece?" he said, his voice laced with condescension. "Don't be absurd, child. We have already established that it is an exercise in futility. Go back to your seat." But she didn't move. She stood her ground, her hands clasped in front of her to stop them from shaking. "Please, Maestro," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I would like to try." He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. He saw the determination in her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw. He saw the raw red skin on her fingertips. He saw a fire he hadn't seen in any of the other students, a fire that was either going to burn brightly or burn out completely. He let out a long, weary sigh as if he was too tired to argue. "Very well," he said, his voice flat. He waved a dismissive hand toward the music stand where the manuscript still lay. "You have 3 minutes. Do not waste my time." He didn't offer to get her music. He didn't offer to adjust her stand. He just stepped back, crossing his arms over his chest, his expression one of utter expectation of failure. He was giving her just enough rope to hang herself with. She walked to the center of the stage, the same spot where the others had stood and failed. She didn't need the music. The notes were etched into her memory, into her muscles, into her soul. She opened her violin case and lifted out her grandfather's old instrument. The dark wood felt solid and real in her hands, a friend in enemy territory. She tucked it under her chin, her body remembering the position from 1,000 hours of practice. She raised the bow. The hall was so silent she could hear her own blood rushing in her ears. The maestro's 3 minutes had begun. She raised the bow. The great hall was so silent that she could hear the faint, almost inaudible hum of the lights overhead. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, wild rhythm that felt completely out of control. For a terrifying second, her mind went blank. The frantic, angry scrawl of notes from the manuscript, which had been her constant companion for weeks, suddenly looked like a foreign language. She could feel the maestro's eyes on her, boring into her, a look of cold expectation on his face. He was waiting for the first mistake, the first squeak of the bow, the first sign of failure. She took a small, shaky breath and let the bow touch the strings. The first note was thin and a little shaky. It wasn't a disaster, but it wasn't good. A few of the students in the front row winced. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the maestro's lips tighten into a familiar, disapproving line. He had seen this 1,000 times before. A student with more courage than sense about to be humbled. The smirk was almost there. She could feel it, but then something inside her clicked. It wasn't a loud, dramatic moment. It was a quiet, internal shift. She stopped thinking about the maestro. She stopped thinking about the students, about the scholarship, about her future. She closed her eyes for just a second, and she wasn't in the great hall anymore. She was back in her tiny room under the eaves, with the smell of old books and stale coffee. She remembered the pain in her fingers, the frustration, the moments of despair. And she remembered her grandfather's voice, telling her to look for a door. She opened her eyes, and the world came back into focus. But it was a different world. The music stand, the maestro, the students, they were all still there, but they had become the background. The only thing that was real was the violin in her hands and the music in her soul. The next notes came out, and they were different. They were stronger, clearer, full of a new confidence. She wasn't just hitting the notes anymore. She was telling the story. The music began to take shape. It wasn't just a string of fast, impossible runs. It was a story of a fight, a desperate struggle against something you couldn't see. Her bow moved across the strings with a new aggression, a controlled fury that she had discovered in those long nights of practice. She used the flat of her fingers for a series of percussive notes, a technique her teachers would have called wrong, but which made the music sound like a frantic heartbeat. In the front row, the students began to lean forward. The pity in their eyes was gone, replaced by a dawning, wide-eyed wonder. They had all seen the manuscript. They knew what was coming. They were waiting for the part where the music became a tangled mess, where any human hand would surely fail. But her hand didn't fail. Her fingers, now tough and calloused, danced on the fingerboard with a life of their own. They moved in ways that seemed to defy anatomy, stretching and leaping from one position to the next with a speed that was breathtaking on the stage. The maestro's arms uncrossed. His disapproving line had softened into a look of intense concentration. He was no longer a judge waiting for a mistake. He was a detective trying to solve a mystery. He saw her unconventional bow hold, the slight sway in her body, the way she used her whole arm, not just her wrist to generate power. These were all things he had taught his students not to do. They were vulgar, incorrect, but watching her, he was seeing them work. He was seeing them not as mistakes, but as solutions. He was seeing the door she had found when everyone else saw only a wall. The music swelled, moving from the frantic struggle into a section of deep, haunting beauty. The furious energy softened into a cry of pure, unadulterated sadness. The sound that came from her grandfather's old violin was no longer just sound. It was feeling. It was the sound of loneliness, of loss, of a heart breaking. The hall was spellbound. No one was breathing. No one was moving. They were all completely lost in the world she was creating with just 4 strings and a bow of HORSE, HAI. She was approaching the final, most impossible part of the piece. The notes on the page were a sheer vertical cliff, a series of runs that went so high and so fast that they seemed to be a joke. This was the part that had made every other expert shake their head. This was the wall. She felt a surge of adrenaline, a final, desperate burst of energy. She thought of her village, of the wind and the waves, of the wild, untamed spirit of the old composer. She poured all of it, all of herself, into the final run. Her bow became a blur, her fingers a whirlwind of motion. The notes flew from the strings, not as separate sounds, but as a single, soaring arc of pure, triumphant sound. It was the sound of a soul breaking free, of a spirit taking flight. It was the sound of "I told you so," without a single word being spoken, and then it was over. The final, highest note hung in the air of the silent hall, shimmering and perfect before it slowly, gently faded into nothing. She stood there, her violin still held in position, her chest heaving. A thin sheen of sweat covered her forehead. Her arm ached with a deep, satisfying exhaustion. The 3 minutes were up, but the silence that followed was heavier and more profound than the silence that had come before. It was a silence filled with awe. No one moved. No one spoke. They were all afraid to break the spell, to shatter the perfect, fragile moment that had just passed. The maestro stood frozen on the stage, his face an unreadable mask of shock and disbelief. He looked at the young woman, not as a student, but as a force of nature. In 3 minutes she had not just played a piece of music. She had changed the very air they breathed. The silence that followed the last fading note was a living thing. It was thick and heavy, filling every corner of the great hall, pressing in on everyone who sat in its grip. For the young woman on the stage, it was the loudest sound she had ever heard. Her arm ached, a deep, satisfying throb that reminded her she was real, that she was still standing. Her lungs burned, and she realized she had been holding her breath. She let it out in a slow, shaky stream, and the world seemed to come back into focus just a little bit. She could see the faces in the front row, their mouths slightly open, their eyes wide with a kind of stunned disbelief. They looked like people who had just seen a ghost, not a performance. For a second, she thought maybe she had dreamed the whole thing, that she had only imagined the music that had just poured out of her. Then someone in the back started to clap. It was a single, sharp sound like a crack of a whip. It was quickly joined by another, and then another. It wasn't polite, respectful applause. It was an explosion. The silence didn't just break. It shattered. The entire room erupted in a wave of sound, a spontaneous, breathless, chaotic roar of clapping and cheering. Students were on their feet, some of them whistling, others just shouting, their faces flushed with excitement. It was the kind of applause reserved for rock stars, not for a quiet scholarship student in a dusty conservatory hall. It was a release of all the tension they had been feeling, all the awe they were experiencing. They weren't just clapping for her. They were clapping because they had just witnessed something impossible, and they needed to make some noise to prove it had actually happened. But through it all, the maestro didn't move. He remained frozen at the side of the stage, his arms still at his sides, his face unreadable. The wall of student applause washed over him, but he seemed not to notice. His eyes were fixed on the young woman, his expression a mixture of shock and intense, almost painful, concentration. As the applause began to die down, students slowly returning to their seats, their eyes still locked on her, he finally moved. He took a step forward, then another. He walked slowly, deliberately onto the stage toward her. The hall fell silent again, a new kind of silence, one filled with anticipation. Every person in the room leaned forward, wondering what he would say. Would he tear her down? Would he find some flaw, some technical error to point out? He stopped in front of her, but he didn't look at her face. He looked at her violin. He looked at the old, dark wood, the worn fingerboard, the strings still vibrating with a faint, almost invisible energy. He looked at it as if it were a holy relic, an object of immense power that he was seeing for the first time. He stood there for a long moment, just looking, the silence stretching out, becoming almost unbearable. "You did not play the notes," he said finally. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the silent hall. It wasn't the voice of a judge or a critic. It was the voice of a student, a seeker. Any monkey can be taught to play the notes. I have spent my life teaching monkeys. He finally lifted his gaze from the violin and looked into her eyes. And in his eyes she saw not defeat, but a profound, earth-shattering respect. "You played the why." He let those words hang in the air. "You played the why." The students looked at each other, confused, but she understood perfectly. She understood what he meant. She hadn't just played the frantic runs and the impossible chords. She had played the composer's frustration, his arrogance, his pain, his joy. She had played the reason the music existed in the first place. "The composer wrote for a phantom," the maestro continued, his voice growing a little stronger, filled with a new kind of energy. "He wrote for an instrument that does not exist, for hands that are not human. I have looked at this manuscript for years, and I saw only a ghost. A fantasy." He reached out a hand, not to touch her, but just to point, a gesture of discovery. "You have just given that phantom a voice. You have shown us all that the hands he was writing for were not his own. They were yours." He turned to face the room, to face the other students who were staring at him, at her in complete awe. "This piece is no longer lost," he announced, his voice ringing with the authority they all knew, but now it was mixed with something new, excitement. "And you," he said, turning back to her, his eyes blazing with a fire she had never seen before, "will perform it with my orchestra. At the spring concert." The young woman felt her knees go weak. She almost dropped her violin. The spring concert. That was the biggest event of the year, a performance that was attended by critics, by agents, by the most important people in the world of classical music. It was an invitation that the most talented student in the school would have dreamed of, and he was offering it to her, the quiet girl from the fishing village. She felt a hot sting behind her eyes, and she had to blink back the tears. She couldn't speak. She could only nod, a small, clumsy gesture that felt completely inadequate. The maestro wasn't finished. He looked back at the other students, and his expression was no longer one of disappointment. It was one of challenge. "Look at her," he commanded them. "This is what I have been trying to teach you. This is courage." She saw a wall, and she did not stop. She did not try to break it down with force. She listened to it. She understood it. She found a way to make it sing. He walked back to the center of the stage, his old steps seeming a little lighter, a little more energetic. "In 3 minutes, this young woman did not just prove me wrong. She proved the entire history of music wrong. She has shown us that there are no impossible pieces, only musicians who have forgotten how to listen." As he spoke, she slowly lowered her violin, her arm feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in. The 2 weeks of pain and frustration, the loneliness, the moments of despair, it had all led to this. She looked out at the faces of her classmates, and she saw that they were no longer looking at her with pity or with indifference. They were looking at her with a new kind of respect, a recognition that she was not just one of them anymore. She had stepped into another world, And as she stood there on the stage, in the center of the silent, spellbound hall, holding her grandfather's old violin, she knew that her life would never be the same. The quiet girl from the village had found her voice, and the whole world was finally listening.